"You're overreacting, it's just dinner with my ex." She rolled her eyes. I said enjoy dessert, then took her replacement to the same restaurant the next night. The manager sent her the photo. I never thought our 3-year anniversary dinner would end with me questioning everything I thought I knew about Renee. I'm Derek, 34, a master stone mason specializing in cathedral restoration. Most people don't realize the artistry involved in bringing centuries-old stonework back to life, but I've spent 12 years perfecting techniques that were nearly lost to time. Renee, my fiancée of 6 months, worked in marketing consulting and claimed to understand my passion for preservation, though I'd started noticing her enthusiasm waning whenever I talked about upcoming restoration projects. That Tuesday night at Chez Laurent, Richmond's most exclusive French bistro, I'd planned everything perfectly. I'd specifically chosen this restaurant because I'd been working on their historic stone wine cellar restoration for months, and I wanted to celebrate our anniversary somewhere that represented the intersection of my craft and our future together. I'd prepaid the entire $800 bill earlier that week, arranged for their best corner table, and even coordinated with their sommelier to pair wines with each course. I thought I was creating a memory that would matter to both of us. Renee arrived 20 minutes late, scrolling through her phone as the maître seated her, barely acknowledging the effort I'd put into the evening. Halfway through our appetizer, she casually mentioned that she'd be having dinner with Mitchell tomorrow evening. Mitchell, her ex-boyfriend from college who'd recently moved back to Richmond for work. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, not because I didn't trust her, but because this was the first I'd heard of any contact with him. When I asked why she hadn't mentioned they'd been in touch, she looked at me like I'd asked something unreasonable. "He reached out a few weeks ago about getting closure," she said, dismissing my concern with a wave of her hand. "We're both adults, Derek. Mature people can maintain friendships with former partners." The way she said it, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, made me feel like I was being unreasonable for having basic questions about my fiancé secretly reconnecting with an ex. I kept my voice low and asked if this was their first meeting since he'd returned to town. That's when her entire demeanor shifted. She set down her wine glass harder than necessary and told me this wasn't their first meeting, that they'd been having dinner once a month for the past 4 months. 4 months of secret meetings while she attended what she'd told me were professional development seminars. I realized every Tuesday evening she'd claimed to be networking with potential clients, she'd actually been rebuilding her connection with the man who'd proposed to her 3 years ago. When I pointed out that the secrecy felt deliberate, she accused me of being insecure and controlling. She told me I was emotionally stunted for not understanding her need for intellectual stimulation that apparently only Mitchell could provide. Other diners were starting to stare as her voice rose, but she seemed energized by the attention, like she was performing for an audience. She told me Mitchell understood her ambitions in ways I never could, that he challenged her intellectually while I just talked about old buildings and dead craftsmanship techniques. The woman I'd been planning to spend my life with was sitting across from me at our anniversary dinner, explaining why another man was better suited to appreciate her mind. I sat there listening to her outline all the ways Mitchell exceeded my capabilities while surrounded by the very stonework I'd spent months restoring, understanding for the first time that she'd never actually seen value in who I was or what I did. I excused myself calmly, walked to the front desk, and settled our $800 bill while Renee continued her lecture about mature relationships to our now empty table. The drive to my workshop gave me 20 minutes to process what had just happened, and by the time I parked behind my restored Victorian building, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I pulled up our shared credit card statements on my laptop, something I'd been meaning to review for months but had trusted Renee to handle responsibly. The numbers told a story that made my stomach turn. Over the past 4 months, there were $3,400 in charges at high-end restaurants I'd never been to, boutique hotels for weekend conferences that apparently never existed, and designer clothing purchases that Renee had claimed were necessary business expenses for client meetings. Every Tuesday evening she told me she was attending professional development seminars had actually cost between $200 and $400 at restaurants I couldn't afford on my craftsman's salary. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to save for our wedding and future home renovations, she'd been funding a secret relationship with money from our joint account. My phone started buzzing around midnight with the first of what would become 67 increasingly frantic messages. She started with accusations that I'd embarrassed her by leaving the restaurant, then escalated to threats about ending our engagement if I didn't grow up and learn to trust her like a real partner should. By 3 a.m., she was alternating between claiming I was emotionally abusive for questioning her friendships and promising she'd cut contact with Mitchell if I just came home and talked through this misunderstanding like adults. I turned off my phone and spent the night in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always made sense to me when relationships didn't. The next morning, I called my brother Lucas, who practiced family law in Norfolk. I explained the situation and asked about my legal obligations since Renee had moved into my inherited Victorian brownstone 2 years ago. Lucas confirmed what I'd hoped, that since the property had been in my family for 3 generations and Renee had never contributed to mortgage payments or major improvements, she had no legal claim to my home or workshop. He also reminded me that I had every right to change my locks and security codes, since she'd been using my property as a base for activities I hadn't consented to. I spent Wednesday morning installing new smart locks and updating all my security system codes, then texted Renee that she could collect her belongings during scheduled appointments with 24-hour notice. Her response was immediate and volcanic, claiming I was illegally evicting her and that she'd call the police if I didn't grant her immediate access to what she now called our shared home. By Thursday evening, she'd enlisted Mitchell to help her demand entry. I watched through my security cameras as they stood on my front porch, with Renee gesturing wildly while Mitchell looked increasingly uncomfortable. When they started pounding on my door, I used the intercom system to calmly explain that I was within my legal rights to control access to my private property, and that Renee could schedule a supervised time to collect her possessions through my attorney. The sight of my ex-fiancée strategizing with her secret boyfriend about how to force their way into my home crystallized something for me. This wasn't about trust or communication or any of the relationship issues she'd been claiming. This was about control, entitlement, and a fundamental disrespect for my autonomy that I'd been too trusting to see clearly. By Friday afternoon, Renee had assembled what she called her support system to pressure me into couples counseling and compromise. Her sister Joyce, mother Patricia, and 3 co-workers from her marketing firm showed up at my workshop unannounced, creating a scene that had my neighboring business owners staring through their windows. Patricia launched into a speech about how my jealousy issues stemmed from my blue-collar background and fear of losing Renee to someone more sophisticated, while Joyce nodded along and suggested that real men don't abandon their partners over minor disagreements about friendship boundaries. They painted me as controlling and insecure, claiming that my inability to accept Renee's need for intellectual stimulation revealed deep-seated insecurity about my education and social status. I listened to their coordinated attack for about 10 minutes before walking to my office and returning with printed copies of our credit card statements. I handed them to Patricia and watched her face change as she reviewed 4 months of charges at expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and boutique shops that coincided perfectly with Renee's supposed professional development activities. The $1,200 spa resort weekend that Renee claimed was a work retreat in Norfolk became particularly interesting when I pulled up Mitchell's LinkedIn profile on my phone, showing him checked in at the exact same location during the same dates. Joyce's supportive narrative started cracking when she saw the receipts, and she accidentally revealed information that Renee probably wished had stayed private. Apparently, Renee had been complaining to her family for months about my boring predictability and expressing genuine regret about not pursuing Mitchell's marriage proposal 3 years earlier when he'd relocated for his consulting career. Joyce mentioned that Renee felt trapped in a relationship with someone who lacked ambition and social sophistication, someone who would never be able to provide the lifestyle she deserved or the intellectual stimulation she craved. While Joyce was accidentally destroying Renee's victim narrative, I was conducting my own digital investigation on my laptop. I'd found Renee's private Instagram account, the one she'd never mentioned to me, where she'd been documenting her secret relationship with carefully curated photos from restaurants and weekend getaways. The spa resort weekend featured romantic sunset photos tagged with Mitchell and captioned about rediscovering authentic connections and learning to prioritize her own happiness. There were months of posts about finally feeling intellectually challenged and appreciated for her mind, all while she was living in my house and spending money from our joint account. Patricia's confident lecture about my inadequacies as a partner started dissolving when I showed her the Instagram evidence and the financial documentation that proved I'd been funding Renee's entire lifestyle, including her BMW lease payments, designer wardrobe, weekly salon appointments, and the $4,200 engagement ring she was still wearing while publicly dating another man. Her 3 coworkers became noticeably uncomfortable when they realized they'd been recruited to intimidate someone who had legitimate grounds for ending his engagement, and one of them quietly mentioned that Renee had been bragging at work about having multiple men competing for her attention. Joyce tried to salvage the situation by claiming that Renee's behavior was just a phase, a temporary confusion caused by stress and uncertainty about the future, but the financial evidence and social media documentation painted a clear picture of deliberate deception and emotional manipulation. By the time they left my workshop, Patricia was apologizing and Joyce was questioning whether they'd received accurate information about the situation, while Renee's coworkers were exchanging uncomfortable glances and discussing how this might affect her professional reputation in Richmond's tight-knit business community. Saturday morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Isabella Rodriguez, the talented sommelier from Chez Laurent whom I'd worked with during my 6-month restoration project on their historic wine cellar. Isabella had witnessed Renee's public dismissal of my concerns 2 nights earlier, and I'd caught her giving me sympathetic looks as I'd quietly settled the bill and left. Our professional relationship had always been cordial and intellectually stimulating, with Isabella showing genuine fascination for the medieval masonry techniques I was using to preserve the cellar's original stonework. She spoke 4 languages fluently, held a master's degree in art history from VCU, and had been documenting the architectural details I'd been restoring for her own research into Richmond's colonial period wine storage systems. When I asked if she'd like to have dinner that evening, she paused for only a moment before agreeing, mentioning that she'd been hoping we might connect outside of our professional consultations since she found my restoration work genuinely inspiring. That evening at Chez Laurent, I discovered aspects of Isabella's personality that our brief work interactions had only hinted at. She was passionate about historical preservation from an academic perspective, having written her thesis on the intersection of European wine culture and American colonial architecture. She asked detailed questions about my restoration techniques, understood the historical significance of the tools I used, and shared stories about wine cellars she'd explored throughout France and Italy during her sommelier training. Henri, the maitre d', who had served Renee and me 2 nights earlier, discreetly mentioned how much happier I seemed, noting the dramatic contrast in my demeanor when dining with someone who appreciated both the restaurant's history and my role in preserving it. Isabella and I were deep in conversation about medieval stone carving techniques when Henri approached our table with an amused expression, mentioning that he had an interesting coincidence to share with us. Apparently, another couple had requested the exact same corner table where Renee had publicly berated me, and they'd specifically mentioned celebrating a reconciliation dinner after working through trust issues. Isabella raised an eyebrow when Henri described the woman as a blonde marketing consultant who'd been emphatic about getting this particular table, claiming it held special significance for her relationship. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach as I realized Renee had brought Mitchell to the same restaurant where she'd humiliated me, probably expecting to create some kind of symbolic victory over the location of our failed anniversary. Henri, who had clearly witnessed enough relationship drama to recognize the situation, offered to take a photograph of Isabella and me enjoying our dessert course, mentioning that he liked to document special moments for couples who seemed genuinely compatible. Isabella agreed enthusiastically, explaining that she wanted to remember her first dinner with someone who understood her passion for historical preservation and cultural documentation. As Henri was adjusting his camera angle to capture both our happy expressions and the architectural details of the dining room that I'd restored, I noticed a commotion near the entrance where the hostess was seating a clearly agitated blonde woman and an uncomfortable-looking man at the corner table. Renee had arrived for her reconciliation dinner with Mitchell, apparently unaware that I was already there with someone who actually appreciated my professional expertise and intellectual curiosity. Henri caught my eye and nodded toward their table with a barely suppressed smile, clearly understanding the perfect timing of this photographic documentation. Isabella, who had noticed the tension but didn't yet understand the full context, was laughing genuinely at something I'd said about the challenges of matching historical mortar compositions, creating a picture that would perfectly capture the natural ease and intellectual connection that had been completely absent from my relationship with Renee. Henri delivered the photograph to Renee's table with the subtle finesse of someone who'd spent decades managing delicate social situations. I watched from across the dining room as he approached their corner table with a silver tray, presenting the photo with a handwritten note that read, "Mr. Derrick seems much happier tonight. Perhaps you'll find our dessert menu more appealing with your new companion." Renee's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the image of me laughing with Isabella over the same table where she'd humiliated me just 2 nights earlier. She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her wine glass, and marched across the restaurant toward our table with Mitchell trailing behind looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The entire dining room turned to watch as she planted herself beside our table and accused me of flaunting a rebound relationship while she was trying to work through our relationship issues with professional counseling and mature communication. Isabella calmly set down her dessert fork and introduced herself as someone who'd known me professionally for months, mentioning that she'd been collaborating with me on the historical documentation of the wine cellar restoration and had developed genuine respect for my expertise and integrity. Mitchell became visibly uncomfortable when Isabella casually mentioned my upcoming contract with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and my reputation as one of the state's premier restoration specialists, clearly realizing that Renee had been describing me as a simple laborer without ambition or intellectual capacity. The contrast between Isabella's respectful acknowledgement of my professional achievements and Renee's previous dismissal of my career became painfully obvious to everyone within earshot. Renee's humiliation deepened as other diners began recognizing the situation and several approached our table to praise my restoration work on their own historic properties. Mrs. Catherine Williams, whose 1847 mansion I'd restored last year, stopped by to thank me for preserving her family's architectural heritage with such skill and sensitivity. Dr. Robert Chin, a professor whose university building restoration had earned a state preservation award, mentioned how impressed the Virginia Historical Society had been with my craftsmanship and attention to historical accuracy. Each interaction highlighted Renee's complete ignorance about my professional reputation and the respect I'd earned within Richmond's preservation community. The situation became even more awkward when James Morrison, the principal of Morrison & Associates Marketing, approached our table to greet Isabella and discovered that the woman causing the scene was his firm's problematic contractor who'd been missing client meetings and producing subpar work for the past several months. Morrison had been planning to terminate Renee's consulting contract due to her unprofessional behavior and missed deadlines, but witnessing her public breakdown at one of Richmond's most exclusive restaurants gave him serious concerns about her judgment and stability. He discreetly mentioned to Isabella that several clients had complained about Renee's attitude and work quality, noting that her behavior tonight confirmed their decision to find more reliable marketing support. Mitchell's discomfort reached its breaking point when Isabella politely asked about his background and learned that he was a mid-level insurance adjuster who'd been exaggerating his consulting credentials to impress Renee, while she'd been describing him as a successful business executive with international connections. The web of deception that had supported their secret relationship began unraveling in real time as multiple witnesses contradicted the narratives they'd been building about themselves and their sophisticated partnership. Henri approached discreetly to suggest that perhaps the conversation might be more appropriate in a private setting, but Renee was too invested in her public performance to accept his diplomatic exit strategy. She demanded to know why I was publicly humiliating her by bringing another woman to our special restaurant, apparently forgetting that she'd brought Mitchell to this same location for their reconciliation dinner. Isabella responded with grace and intelligence, pointing out that the restaurant held significance for many people who appreciated its history and that she'd been documenting its architectural features long before tonight's dinner. The entire scene was witnessed by at least 30 other diners, many of whom were prominent members of Richmond's business and cultural community, ensuring that Renee's unprofessional behavior would become a topic of conversation at future networking events and social gatherings throughout the city. Within 2 weeks, the consequences of Renee's public breakdown at Chez Laurent rippled through Richmond's interconnected business community with devastating efficiency. Morrison and Associates terminated her consulting contract immediately, citing concerns about her judgment and professionalism after multiple clients reported her erratic behavior and missed appointments. Two other major clients, including the law firm that had witnessed her restaurant meltdown, quietly ended their marketing agreements and requested different account managers for future projects. The gossip network in Richmond's business circles worked faster than social media, and Renee's reputation for dramatic outbursts and questionable personal conduct made her unemployable at most reputable firms within the city. Meanwhile, my relationship with Isabella was developing naturally without the pressure and manipulation that had characterized my time with Renee. Isabella introduced me to Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief curator at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, who had been searching for a restoration specialist capable of handling their upcoming exhibition on colonial architecture and craftsmanship. Our conversation led to my biggest contract yet, an 18-month project to restore the stonework at Maymont Estate that would not only establish my reputation as Virginia's premier restoration specialist but also provide the financial security I'd never achieved while supporting Renee's expensive lifestyle. Isabella's influence opened doors I hadn't known existed, connecting me with museum curators, university professors, and preservation societies who valued my expertise and treated my work as the art form it truly was. She also started attending my weekend workshops where I taught traditional stone carving techniques to local artisans, showing genuine fascination with the historical methods that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen. Renee's attempts at reconciliation became increasingly desperate as her professional and financial situation deteriorated. She sent lengthy emails through her sister Joyce, claiming that Mitchell had been using her for companionship and that she finally realized my stability and craftsmanship represented true success and security. She admitted that she'd been confused and immature, that she'd mistaken excitement for love and stability for boredom, but that she now understood what genuine partnership looked like after experiencing Mitchell's superficial attention and empty promises. I forwarded all her communications to Lucas, who responded through legal channels that any further contact would be considered harassment and that she should focus on rebuilding her own life rather than attempting to return to mine. Mitchell contacted me directly through LinkedIn with a lengthy apology, explaining that Renee had manipulated him by claiming I was emotionally abusive and financially controlling, painting herself as a victim trapped in a relationship with someone who stifled her ambitions and undermined her self-worth. He revealed that she'd been telling him I refused to support her career goals and that I'd been sabotaging her professional opportunities out of jealousy and insecurity. Mitchell seemed genuinely shocked when he learned that I'd actually been subsidizing her entire lifestyle, including her business expenses, car payments, and the designer wardrobe she claimed was necessary for client meetings. He mentioned that Renee had described me as possessive and controlling when actually I'd been giving her complete financial freedom to pursue her goals while she used that freedom to fund a secret relationship. His apology was sincere but unnecessary, since I understood that he'd been receiving the same manipulative treatment that had taken me 3 years to recognize and escape. Isabella's support during this period was invaluable, not because she rescued me from Renee's manipulation, but because she demonstrated what healthy partnership actually looked like. She celebrated my professional achievements, contributed her own expertise to our shared interests, and never made me feel like I needed to apologize for my background or ambitions. The Maymont Estate contract led to additional opportunities with the Virginia Historical Society and the Richmond Public Library's Architectural Preservation Committee, establishing connections that would sustain my career for decades while providing the intellectual stimulation and professional respect that Renee had claimed only Mitchell could offer her. 6 months after the Chez Laurent incident, Isabella and I announced our engagement at the same restaurant where Henri had unknowingly documented the beginning of our relationship. Henri provided complimentary champagne and shared the story with other staff members about how my professional dignity and grace under pressure had impressed Isabella during my previous relationship's very public dissolution. The contrast couldn't have been more striking, Isabella's genuine excitement about our future together compared to Renee's calculated manipulation and emotional blackmail during our final months together. Isabella appreciated my methodical approach to planning our wedding, understanding that attention to detail was part of my professional training and personal character rather than evidence of controlling behavior or emotional limitations. We chose to have our ceremony at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where I'd recently completed a major restoration of the altar stonework, surrounded by craftsmanship that represented both my professional achievement and our shared appreciation for historical preservation. Renee's final desperate attempt to disrupt my happiness came through a registered letter claiming she was pregnant and needed my financial support for medical expenses and childcare preparation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 6 months after our anniversary dinner breakdown, and included ultrasound images and medical documentation that initially seemed legitimate. Isabella's response was measured and intelligent, suggesting we verify the claims through proper legal channels rather than responding emotionally to what could be another manipulation attempt. Her friend Dr. Amanda Chin, who worked in obstetrics at VCU Medical Center, examined the documentation and discovered that the medical records had been altered and the ultrasound images downloaded from a pregnancy website rather than generated by actual medical equipment. Further investigation through Isabella's connections in Richmond's medical community revealed that Renee had undergone a medical procedure 3 months earlier that made pregnancy impossible, but she'd apparently hoped I wouldn't verify her claims before providing the financial support she desperately needed. Lucas responded to her letter through official legal channels, stating that any further contact would be considered harassment and that we had evidence of her fraudulent medical claims that could result in criminal charges if she continued her attempts at extortion. Meanwhile, my restoration work was gaining recognition beyond Richmond's local preservation community. The Virginia Historical Society featured my Maymont Estate project in their quarterly newsletter, leading to an invitation to restore the stonework at their headquarters building in downtown Richmond. The project would take 8 months and establish my reputation throughout the Mid-Atlantic region while providing the financial stability that would allow Isabella and me to purchase our own historic property for renovation. Renee's last public appearance in my life came when she showed up at my workshop with a local news crew, claiming to expose how successful women are discarded for younger alternatives when they become inconvenient to their partner's image and career advancement. The reporter, who had apparently been fed a story about age discrimination and professional jealousy, seemed prepared to film a sympathetic piece about workplace harassment and relationship exploitation. However, Isabella's credentials and our relationship timeline quickly undermined Renee's narrative when the reporter discovered that Isabella was actually 2 years older than Renee, held advanced degrees from respected universities, and had been working professionally with me for months before our personal relationship developed. The story collapsed entirely when several of my clients volunteered to speak about Renee's disruptive behavior at professional events and her attempts to undermine my business relationships during our engagement. Dr. Martinez from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts mentioned Renee's inappropriate conduct at a Preservation Society gala where she'd loudly criticized my work and claimed I was limiting her career opportunities through possessive and controlling behavior. The news crew left without filming anything usable, and the reporter later contacted me to apologize for not verifying Renee's claims before scheduling the ambush interview. Our wedding was featured in Architectural Digest's regional edition for taking place in the cathedral where I'd restored the original medieval stonework, with Isabella's wine expertise and my craftsmanship creating a celebration that perfectly represented our shared values and mutual respect. The article highlighted how our professional collaboration had evolved into personal partnership, emphasizing the importance of shared intellectual interests and complementary skills in building lasting relationships. We spent our honeymoon touring historic wine cellars throughout France and Italy, with Isabella researching preservation techniques while I studied European restoration methods that I could adapt for American colonial architecture. The trip represented everything Renee had claimed to want: intellectual stimulation, cultural sophistication, and international experience, but had never been willing to build through genuine partnership and mutual support.